we spend like so much time thinking about, the government and what they're doing and all the things that companies are trying to sell us.
Yeah.
But have you ever stopped to like think about all the other stuff that you do, like all the groups you're a part of that you actually want to be in?
Right.
From, your family to your book club to that, volunteer group you're passionate about.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what we're diving into today. It's this whole concept of civil society.
Right.
And I know it sounds a little bit, textbooky.
Yeah.
But it's actually super relevant to a lot of this stuff that you experience every day.
It is. It's the backdrop of our lives.
Exactly.
Yeah. And today we're going to be looking at this idea of the rediscovery of civil society through the work of this very influential sociologist, Robert Nisbet.
Okay.
And we're going to be drawing on an analysis by Matthew Continetti.
Cool.
And I think this is so important because this is kind of like understanding how society works on a deeper level. So it's not just about the government, it's not just about the market, it's about all the stuff in between.
Yeah, it's like the glue that holds it all together in a way.
Yeah.
So that's our mission today, is to really understand what Nisbet meant by civil society, why he thought it was so important.
Yeah.
And how his ideas can help us make sense of like the crazy world that we're living in.
That's right.
So help us kick this off. Where did Nisbet even start?
So Nisbet really begins his intellectual journey at Berkeley in 1935.
Okay.
And a very influential figure for him early on is a historian by the name of Frederick J. Taggart.
Okay.
And Taggart was interested in progress and civilization, so he wasn't just looking at, what happened on this date and that date.
Yeah.
He was looking at these larger trends in history.
Okay.
How do civilizations rise and fall, and what are the forces that are driving that?
Got it.
And this got Nisbet really thinking about the fact that, societal development doesn't always just go up. Yeah. There are periods of decline. There are periods of, stagnation.
Right.
And this really fed into his later skepticism about just sort of blindly embracing modernization.
Okay.
He thought you have to think about what are we losing when we modernize?
Okay.
What are the trade-offs?
Yeah.
So that was a very important early influence.
So he wasn't just like narrowly focused on, sociology.
Yeah, he was very broadly interested in all sorts of things.
Got it.
He read Herodotus. He read Spengler.
Okay.
He studied ancient Rome.
Wow.
And actually, his doctoral research was on the relationship between family and kinship and political order.
Okay.
So he was already thinking about, these building blocks of society as being really important for understanding how political systems work.
Fascinating.
And then he really discovers this group of European thinkers.
Okay.
And he finds a huge common ground with them.
Okay.
These are thinkers like Haller-Bonald and de Maistre.
Okay.
And what unites them is this belief that society comes first.
Okay.
So society is prior to the individual, and it's prior to the state.
Okay.
So they see the individual as being embedded in this network of relationships, traditions, institutions.
Right.
And that's what shapes who they are.
So it's not just a collection of individuals making a society. It's like these inherent groups which shape individuals.
And a very influential figure in this tradition is Edmund Burke.
Okay.
Who Nisbet really admired.
Yeah.
And Burke had this great phrase about the little platoons.
Okay.
And this really resonated with Nisbet.
Got it.
The idea that the most important parts of society are these local communities, these associations, the family, the neighborhood, the church. These are the places where we develop our loyalties, our affections, our sense of right and wrong.
I see.
This is really the bedrock of a healthy social order.
It's interesting because you think about like the first places where you learn about right and wrong.
Right.
It is, your family.
Yeah.
Your close friends. Like you said, your church community.
Exactly.
So it makes a lot of sense.
And Nisbet saw America as having a unique history in this regard.
Okay.
He noticed that America had a strong tradition of voluntary associations.
Yeah.
And that this made Americans less reliant on the state than people in other countries.
I see.
So he looked back at the early republic, and you saw communities organizing their own schools, their own charities, their own systems of mutual support, often without needing to turn to the government.
So there's this history of really strong local communities.
Exactly.
And less reliance on the federal government.
Yeah.
But you sent over some stuff that talks about this idea of the erosion of civil society.
Right.
So what was Nisbet worried about?
So Nisbet was worried about what he called the modern release of the individual from traditional ties.
Okay.
In other words, the weakening of these bonds of community.
Yeah.
And he saw this as having a political consequence, which was the growing power of the state. His argument was that these intermediate groups, these what Burke called subdivisions, actually provided a kind of buffer between the individual and the state.
I see.
So when those groups weaken, the individual is more directly connected to the state.
And therefore more reliant on the state. Got it.
And so he thought this was a real danger to political freedom.
Yeah, because then if those local structures aren't there, people might turn to the state to, provide that support or order.
Exactly.
We were also talking about the New Deal era.
Yeah.
How did Nisbet view that period of huge government expansion?
So Nisbet was very concerned about the growth of the federal government during the Depression.
Okay.
He understood the severity of the crisis.
Yeah.
But he worried that this expansion of state power was coming at the expense of these traditional community structures.
Okay.
And he wasn't necessarily against any of the specific policies, but he was worried about the long-term implications of this shift in the balance of power.
So it wasn't about those specific programs being, good or bad.
Right.
It was about this long-term implication.
Yeah, the precedent it set.
Okay.
And for Nisbet, it's really important to understand how he defined social institutions.
Okay.
He didn't just see them as, gatherings of people.
Yeah.
He saw them as structures that have authority, that perform functions, and that command allegiance.
Interesting.
So really good examples of this are the family and religious institutions.
Okay.
And he saw these institutions as being threatened by the growing power of the state.
So the main conflict for Nisbet wasn't, Republicans versus Democrats or capitalism versus socialism.
It's state versus the social group.
Versus intermediary institutions.
Exactly.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
So he's really reframing how we think about, the power dynamics of society.
And that's why he thought these social associations were so important.
Okay, so if they're so important, what do they do?
Right. So Nisbet argued that our most fundamental needs, our intellectual needs, our spiritual needs, our moral needs, are best met in the context of family, church, and the local community.
Yep.
These are the places where we can really grapple with these big questions
in
a meaningful way.
Right.
In a way that you just can't do in a larger, more bureaucratic setting.
That makes sense.
And he even went so far as to say that these groups are virtually indispensable for maintaining economic and political order.
Wow.
So he really saw them as the foundation of a healthy society.
Because they provide that, base level of shared values, shared purpose.
Yes. And when they're strong, they create a sense of responsibility, a sense of belonging.
Right.
And this leads to greater social stability.
And when they weaken?
When they weaken, you get instability.
Okay.
And this often creates a demand for the state to step in.
So it's like a feedback loop.
Right.
The weaker these groups get, the more the state has to grow to compensate.
Exactly.
And he talked about universities too, right?
Yes. He was very worried about universities.
Okay.
He thought that they were becoming too reliant on government funding.
Interesting.
And he worried that this would compromise their intellectual independence.
Okay.
So, if you're dependent on the government for your funding, it can be hard to really challenge the status quo.
Right, to be truly independent. And do your own research.
Exactly.
So it sounds like he was pretty pessimistic about.
He was a bit of a pessimist.
Yeah.
He was writing in what he called the troubled century.
Okay.
So, he had lived through 2 world wars.
Right.
He had seen the rise of totalitarian ideologies.
Yeah.
So he was very aware of the fragility of civilization.
Totally understandable.
Yeah.
But it wasn't all doom and gloom, was it?
No, not at all.
What was his positive vision?
So Nisbet's positive vision was to preserve what he called the autonomies and immunities of these social groups. So he wanted to protect them from the encroachments of both the state and political movements.
Got it.
And he really believed in what he called social pluralism, which is the idea that you have a diversity of independent associations, each with its own sphere of influence.
Okay.
And he contrasted this with what he called political universalism, which is the idea that the state should have ultimate authority over everything.
So it's about having this balance of power.
Yes.
But these groups have their own space.
Exactly.
So.
And he saw this as being really important for a number of reasons.
Right.
First of all, it allows for the development of different kinds of social skills at different levels of society.
Okay.
So you learn different things in your family, then you learn in your church, then you learn in your professional association, and all of these skills are important for a healthy society.
And it also helps prevent the state from getting too big.
Exactly. When power is dispersed.
Yeah.
It's less likely to be abused.
That makes sense.
And, it wasn't just about traditional institutions like family and church.
Right.
He also saw labor unions, ethnic groups, professional associations as being really vital parts of civil society. These are all groups that allow people to come together to express their interests, to engage in collective action, to articulate their identities. Without being directly controlled by the state.
It's like these pathways for people to connect and, have their voices heard.
Exactly.
But later on, he got a little bit worried about some of these groups, too.
He did, yeah.
What was that about?
So in his later work, Nisbet became concerned about what he called the fatal embrace.
Okay.
And this was the tendency for even independent organizations to become increasingly reliant on government funding.
Okay.
And he worried that this would ultimately erode their autonomy.
Got it.
So, if you're taking money from the government, it can be hard to criticize the government.
Right.
It can be hard to really be independent.
It's that balancing act again.
It is. It is.
Of needing resources, but also needing to be independent.
That's right.
So it sounds like he was saying that civil society has a really big impact on how we see the world, how we make decisions.
Yes. He thought that a healthy civil society with all these different independent centers of thought and action makes it much harder for elites to impose their worldview on everyone else. And this is because you have this diversity of perspective that encourages critical thinking.
Got it.
And the text even mentions this historian Gertrude Himmelfarb, who makes this really interesting point, that when these intermediary institutions are weak, it becomes harder to make tough decisions.
Because
you don't have that shared understanding, you don't have that common ground.
It's harder to compromise.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And, this all goes back to the idea that our understanding of the world is shaped by the groups we belong to.
The groups we belong to.
Our social connections.
It's not just an individual pursuit.
It's not.
Yeah.
It's very much a social process.
So Nisbet's ideas are similar to people like...
Yeah, he was very much influenced by Burke. And Tocqueville, who also emphasized the importance of these social bonds for human flourishing.
Got it.
These are things that the state can't provide. And that the market can't provide.
They can only be found...
in civil society.
Yeah. So how did he see civil society interacting with, the government and the economy?
Right.
They don't exist in isolation, do they?
They don't.
So what was his take on that?
So for Nisbet, a truly balanced society requires an appreciation for all three of these spheres. The voluntary associations, the government, and the economy.
The market.
Right.
And they all have their roles.
It's
not about saying, one is good, one is bad.
Right.
It's about finding that right balance.
It's about finding that equilibrium.
Where they can all
work together.
Yeah. For the good of everyone.
And that's a challenge.
It is a challenge.
It's an ongoing challenge.
It's complex.
It is complex.
There are no easy answers. This has been a really fascinating look at Nisbet.
Yeah.
And his ideas.
He was a really interesting thinker.
So for our listeners, what are the key takeaways here?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that these independent groups, these voluntary associations, are really, really important.
Okay.
They shape our lives.
Yeah.
They shape the health of our society, and we need to protect them from
the encroachments of the state.
And
from the, excessive power of the market.
Right.
And so I think Nisbet's work really reminds us to pay attention
to these little platoons.
These
building blocks of society. Because it's easy to get caught up in all the headlines.
Yeah.
About what's happening in Washington.
Right.
Or what's happening on Wall Street.
Right.
But we need to remember that these smaller groups are really where it's at.
They're the heart of society.
So here's a thought for everyone listening.
Okay.
Take a minute
Yeah.
And think about all the groups you're a part of.
Okay.
You know your family,
yeah.
your neighborhood,
yeah.
any clubs you're in,
all right.
sports teams, volunteer organizations.
Mm-hmm.
How do those groups shape your life?
Yeah.
Your values? Your sense of purpose.
How do they make you feel like you belong?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what would happen if those groups disappeared, right?
What if their influence just started to fade away?
Yeah. What would we lose?
Exactly.
Yeah.
How would that change things?
Right. What would the consequences be?
And how does thinking about this through Nisbet's lens change how you view the role of these little platoons?
That's a great question for all of us to consider.
It is.
Yeah.
As we go about our lives.
Yeah. I encourage all of our listeners to keep thinking about this.
Me too.
Yeah. Go out and observe.
Yeah.
See how these ideas play out.
Yeah.
In the real world.
In your own communities.
In your own community.
And as always, thank you so much for listening.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been great.